views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to reporters and editors and writers and journalists and sometimes filmmakers and photographers, authors and other people who create stuff and put something out in the Bronx. And I said about authors deliberately because our second segment is going to involve a fascinating book that has come across our presence in the borough of the Bronx. But we're going to start off with an old-time friend of ours, David Brand, who's a senior reporter at City Limits. So, David, nice to see you again.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me back.
And you will thank your 2-year-old son for the beautiful background. I appreciate that.
I have to. Yeah, this is the best background I've had so far, I think.
There you go. Listen, I told you before the show, and I'm going to lead off the segment with it. When I read your article, and the article is called "The New York City Council Considers a Bill to Probe Why Homeless Are Denied Supportive Housing," I have to tell you, I thought it was among the craziest things I had ever heard. It seems to me, if we're going to provide some support, we should start with the people who need it most. Mm-hmm. And from your article, it seems clear to me that the people who need it most are not getting it and maybe lowest on the totem pole, and I just can't imagine it. So why don't you maybe start from the beginning and talk about the notion of supportive housing for homeless people and why it's not getting to the people who are most needy for it.
Supportive housing is a really important resource in New York City. We're dealing with a historic homelessness crisis. There were just 46,000 people staying in homeless shelters run by the Department of Homeless Services just this week, each night this week. And so we need housing solutions. More and more often, supportive housing becomes kind of a reference for leaders, for policymakers, and it is very important. There's about 35,000 units of supportive housing, mostly for people who have experienced homelessness. But vacancies are kind of few and far between because many of the units are already occupied. And so people who are living in homeless shelters or on the streets, but it's very hard to get into supportive housing if you're living on the streets, mostly shelters, are kind of competing with one another for a limited amount of resources. It's a big time supply problem. There's also a problem that advocates point out that providers will choose the people who need the fewest services.
Because it's easier for them to deliver it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not, there's a lot of...
does not compute here. I'm trying to put the dots together. It doesn't work.
And that's the purpose of this bill, because as more and more people cite supportive housing as like the main solution for ending homelessness in New York City, then going to need to build a lot more of it, but also there's nuance here. Not everybody needs it. People who need it aren't getting it. People who have severe mental illness need even higher level of support, but those don't exist. So
let's define supportive housing. Now, you mentioned something that I was going to bring up. If you take a step back and look at the whole system, look at the people sleeping on the subways, and now there's stories coming out saying that, again, still, they would rather not be in shelters. Incredibly, it's better for them to be sleeping on a subway bench, which is you can't even imagine. But the one thing that you need to deal with whatever their issues are, whether they be, let's say, DV issues or mental health issues or even substance abuse issues, we need support to help them. And I think logic and everybody would agree with that. And so why don't you define for us, before we talk into what's not happening, the supportive housing that's there and why is it so valuable to these people who really may need it?
Sure. So there are basically two types of supportive housing, and this is kind of simplifying things, but there's site-specific supportive housing, which is permanent housing, permanent apartments. People sign leases, they pay rent, usually with the help of a subsidy like Section 8. Pretty much an entire building is devoted to this permanent housing with on-site social service support. mental health support, case management, counseling, recreation. And then there's something called scattered site supportive housing. And these are apartments in the community that are rented out by nonprofit providers and then subleased to tenants who have experienced homelessness. And it's generally people with mental illness. There's also supportive housing for families, for survivors of domestic violence, for people with HIV/AIDS. But those are the two types: the site-specific and the scattered site supportive housing.
I'm going to read right from your piece as it stands. Just about listen to this number: 1 in 5 supporting housing applicants get an apartment,
Hmm.
according to the Supporting Housing Network of New York and the Coalition for the Homeless. It just seems kind of crazy. Is this the kind of thing that you throw money at, and that's why it has to go to legislation to legislate that has to be part of, let's say, the city budget? Is that where we're at? That it's just a matter of let's do it, or is, of course, one of the problems location problems and availability problems?
Yeah, I mean the main problem I think you'd hear from advocates for most advocates of the rights to homeless, or from supportive housing providers, or from lawmakers, is that you need more money to fund more development of supportive housing, and that would address the supply issue. Because, as you said, only 1 in 5 applicants is getting a placement, and that's ultimately a supply problem. But as we mentioned earlier, that it does lead to what they call screening or creaming, where they will choose a person who is they find to be the best fit for
Or
that site.
or better off, so that they don't have to provide a more stringent program of services. It reminds me of the initial dialogue about charter schools,
Hmm.
in that charter schools, they alleged, were cherry picking who they
Mhm.
wanted to be in the school, because it would make them look better. And they were certainly in the beginning, maybe less so now, but they were fighting for their lives, so to speak, and their establishment of their programs. To me, and this, it comes up just about everywhere, in every Bronx neighborhood where there's an attempt to cite some sort of housing, whether supportive or not. The nature of the organizations that run them always seems to come into question.
Hmm.
And maybe I'm making a judgment that I ought not to make, but you're suggesting it by saying, they're doing a good job and an important job, but maybe not the whole job. Am I being unfair?
No, I don't think you're being unfair. I mean, I think there's a lot of nuance to it. I think people who get into this line of work, uh, social workers, case managers in particular, they're not getting paid well. They're doing really hard
Ah,
work. They are basically making, a career decision based on ideological reasons. Like, they
right. That
want to help
they
people,
wanted to
and
help the
yeah.
problem. Yeah.
And so on an individual basis, though, sometimes that does lead to this kind of creaming or screening. And I
Right.
don't think it's some like large uh, uh, deliberate process of saying, well, we want this person because they're easy. But I think on a case by case basis, that does end up happening. And so, and there's going to definitely be like organizations that are bad actors and others that are like sterling examples of social service.
Social service abuse. There was that guy, and I'm sorry I didn't remember his name, who had skimmed a lot of money off the top for vacations and everything else, and that gives the whole. Maybe that's what got me thinking the
Well,
worst,
yeah,
so to
yeah. You
speak.
see that was probably the CEO of the shelter provider,
That's
Core
correct.
Services, and so
That is correct.
supportive housing will differentiate it from shelters. Shelters temporary. Supportive housing, this is permanent housing with supports on site or visiting. So maybe that would lead to less corruption in that regard.
Yeah.
But I think that's why we need reporting. I think that's what advocates
Ah,
would say. Like, that's why we need
that's why we need
this
David
bill.
Brand.
Well, or reporting by journalists, but
Oh,
I
I
mean
see.
more reporting by the city to say, like, this is why someone was
I see.
denied, and you could find patterns based on that reporting.
Right.
Like, they keep saying this person needs a higher level of care, higher level of care. Well, like, is there a higher level of care available? And if there's not, how could the city or the state direct more funding to create that
Right.
higher level of care so that
And
people aren't being screened out like that?
And this bill in the city council would potentially insist that there are certain requirements for the providers.
Yeah, it would insist that the Department of Homeless Services and the Human Resources Administration like compile and publish annual reports on specifically why people were denied placement in supportive housing, how many people are awaiting placement, and that kind of transparency and specificity would highlight problems
Mhm.
like this creaming, screening,
Right.
cherry picking, but also would you could find gaps in the types of housing that's available, in the referrals that uh, Department of Homeless Services is making to these nonprofit providers. If DHS thinks this person's a good fit, the provider says, "Well, actually, they're not a good fit for us. This is why." You can look at that across an entire system and determine what resources are really needed.
Now, as I understand it, this is a bill that council members, at least for this session, we're going to have a new city council on January 1st, are behind, but it has not come to a vote. And the Speaker, Corey Johnson, has not put it to a vote. Wonder if he's waiting for it to just pass to January and let somebody else handle
Yeah.
it. Now, just to let people know, we're recording this on Monday, the 6th. And they are going to have a stated meeting with some voting on Thursday. I don't know if this is on the docket and if this will come up or not, but maybe you know better than I do, Dave.
I think this one's not going to make it
Yeah.
into this upcoming stated meeting, which then there's one more left after that. So that's going to be an opportunity for this bill and many other pieces of
Well,
legislation that
that are still out there.
yeah.
David, you want to give us a sneak preview as what you're thinking about or working on as we get toward the end of the year, or do we not have anything yet?
Yeah, sure thing.
I'm
So
fishing here.
I'm working on a story. Today's Monday. This will be coming out Tuesday. I think it's the
Right.
5-year anniversary of two little girls who were staying in a cluster site shelter unit in a building in Hunts Point were killed by a radiator explosion. And so
Oh my goodness.
revisiting what's going on at that building,
Oh
uh,
boy.
the tenants in that building 5 years later are still fighting the landlord for safer conditions, for functioning elevator, for a heating system
Hmm.
that they're
Now,
not
is
scared
this
of
this
destroying.
is a shelter? You said.
This is it's an apartment building, but the
Got it.
city had previously rented out apartments in that building for use as they called it cluster site shelter
Right.
units, and so they paid the landlord and said, "Let us use this, and we'll put homeless families in it." The families had no like actual rights to the
Dave,
units as they
we got to go, but I just want to tell you something that you've already said, and I reinterpreted. This is why we need reporting.
This is why we need
So,
reporting.
and that's why we have David Brand and our great friends at City Limits. Thank you for a great job. There was a part of me that regretted I asked you what you were working on. That's not a fun story,
Always
but
good stuff.
that's why we have great reporters like David Brand, the senior reporter at City Limits. David, happy holidays to you and to your son, who's a budding artist, and we'll bring him on the Bronx Buzz to show off his work one day.
I'll
So,
give them
thank
a
you
heads
so
up.
much.
Thanks so
Happy
much for
holidays.
having me. Happy
Sure.
holidays.
We'll take a short break. When we come back, we're going to talk about a new book about the life of John Lewis that has been put into form that kids will appreciate. And I think it's worthwhile for them, and for you and for me to take a look at it.